Hi, everybody. Welcome to Zone 1. We've got a really fantastic episode for you this week. Ellen and I were able to steal an opportunity to sit down with the ubiquitous Steve Cohen. Now, some of you might know who Steve is. He is primarily known as the longtime creative director and production designer for Billy Joel, and has designed all of Billy's shows since really the very beginning. He's well known beyond that. However, he's worked with an amazing array of artists that include Elton John and Mariah Carey and John Mellencamp, and most recently the huge new Eagles tour that's out is his design. And full disclosure, I have had the opportunity recently to do a lot of work with Steve, including the new Blake Shelton Back to the Honky Tonk tour and Billy Joel's new stadium tour that he is doing with Stevie Nicks. And in both those cases, Steve and I were able to deploy artificial intelligence and Unreal Engine tools in that process to really radically disrupt how big live shows happen. So we're going to talk about that on this podcast. We're going to talk about Billy. We're going to talk about Steve's career and where he thinks the future of entertainment is going. So settle in and enjoy another episode of Zone 1.
You're really our first star, but since you and Bob have done these like really fabulous projects lately, and you like somehow got Blake Shelton interested in AI, I mean, it's really time to talk about all that, right?
Absolutely. Well, it's all new exploration for me. It's a little bit more, Bob's been immersed in this for a lot longer than I have. But, like all new creative technologies, when they get applied in the real world in a different discipline, that's when I think the spark happens on how this stuff can scale up to our industry. And I think a lot of the hoopla about AI is the same thing that I've always believed about any new technology. Like that new technology is going to supplant, sweat equity. Like you're going to have a button that you push that's going to be able to deliver you what your vision is and not have to do any of the heavy lifting. And I think the same thing with the evolution of lighting products, instruments, control, computer programming, and all that stuff. There's an element of all of that that is equipment and technology and software driven. But the real art happens when you combine that with artisans, with people who, have a discipline that's deeper than just knowing how ones and zeros come together and how they create a particular effect. Right. I've always thought that, I look at the new crop of designers, meaning people that are, 20 years younger than me or 30 years younger than me. And for the most part, they came up, the same way I did. They worked, on crews. They worked as technicians. They had a penchant for art and creativity. They probably went to school and learned, design principles. But the generation under them, the guys in their 20s or in their early 30s, I think suffer from a lack of creative education and observation, because you just throw this shit at them that can do anything they possibly want, and they look at a posting from a Chinese party event and they go, I can figure out how to replicate that, and they're able to execute these spectacularly eye-popping lighting chases and all that stuff. They got no soul, and they're not motivated in any kind of theme and a narrative. And I'm not taking away from the fact that stuff is important and exists. But for me, anything that has any lasting value has to have an underlying narrative, and has to have an underlying theme, and has to have roots based in something other than what it is. And in the Blake Shelton scenario, what ended up happening for us, and Bob and I both talked about this, is, we came in with preconceived ideas, and then we discovered that this tool gave us the opportunity to create an environment on the fly, and we threw out the old ideas. And every time we went back to the stuff that we had pre-planned or pre-thought, it didn't hold up to the marvel of being able to create in real time in this environment. And I think that there's a couple of things that we were able to do with this show that I've wanted to do for a very long time. I referenced, when we started this thing, I referenced a Madonna show that I saw, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe. It might have been a little bit longer than that. And she had a big, huge video wall up there. And the opening of the show was her on stage. And it was a kind of long, dramatic 3, 4, 5-minute opening. And it was the interior of a cathedral. And it didn't fucking do anything except reveal itself, as if the sun was coming up through a window, and as the day was happening, and there was a light that would come up behind the altar. And for 3.5, 4 minutes, I was in that place. I was in that place. I didn't care about what was going on with Madonna or the costumes or anything. I was in that place. And it was executed very well. Musically, I can't remember at all what the song was, but I, from that point on, and that's what, 15 years ago, I think, I always thought that that's what we should be doing with video. That when you put video on as virtual scenery, that you have this ability to create depth and an environment, and that's what it should be, other than playing animated backdrops behind songs. One of the problems that you run into when you're trying to generate content, and this is one of Bob's biggest, crucibles, is that and Butch Allen said this to me many years ago, nobody knows how to do lights, but everybody's a video editor. Everybody watches TV. Everybody knows what would be cool, and they play video games, and so everybody has an opinion about it, and everybody thinks they can do it. So you're automatically at a deficit when you're trying to come up with something original, because as original as you come up with, there's someone who's got another opinion. It's too literal, it's too specific, it's too red, it's too blue, it's too green. When you are originating content that is based in an environment, the argument stops. There's no argument, because you're coming from a place of, you're grounded. You're coming from a place that has a narrative, that has a history, that is very hard to argue with. They may argue with the execution a little bit, but at the end of the day, if you're coming from that sense of place, it almost short circuits people's opinions. That's not to say that if we were sitting in a room with Beyonce, she wouldn't get into it right away and know exactly what we were doing and give her opinions and make us do, say that's all real good, but what I really want is this, and then we would have to execute it. But one of the things that I learned in this process is, so what? I watch Bob arduously create these very beautiful animated content pieces, invest energy, emotion, and time in all of them, and have the manager say, yeah, but it's a little too literal. And it's crushing. It's just crushing, because you take ownership, and you've already gone through the, is it too literal? Is it to this? Is it to that? That would be better. Oh, is it in the style guide? Oh, does it relate to what I think the artist is thinking? Because you never know what these freaking artists are thinking anyway. So he's already pre-chewed all of this stuff up, so that when a manager or even an artist says, yeah, but it's confusing, or it's distracting, or whatever their comment would be, you're gutted. But when you show them something that comes from the place that you've created for them, that they feel comfortable in, and that they feel like they are in a place, and then you take that, you get much more approval real fast, and you get a little bit less of an argument during that whole process. The other thing is that if you're fortunate enough, like we were in this Blake Shelton thing, to be working side by each, where I'm I'm composing a color palette for the songs and an idea for some kind of focuses and how I think I want the lighting to go, with another collaborator who's then taking that and then chewing that up and spitting it out in his own unique fashion. And then to my right is Bob, and we're like, hey, this is this kind of song. What do we want to do with this environment? And then he goes in and starts creating based on that environment, and we collaborate back and forth. There's something that's, first of all, very true about the execution. It's very honest, and it comes from a place of authenticity.
It felt very much to me like playing music. Like, it reminded me of when in college I was in bands, or, you know, while I was in high school and college, I played both in bands, like rock bands, but I was in bands and jazz band and stuff. And this mode of how Steve and I worked on the show, it felt like we were jamming. Like it felt like that back and forth of handing a musical phrase back and forth, and then one player would riff on it and hand it back, and then the next player would riff on it and hand it back, and suddenly you're creating this layered composition, and it becomes apparent. And that's like those moments when you're an audience member in a little jazz club, and the guitar player does a solo and the piano player does a solo, and then the drum player does a thing, and then it all comes together and everyone has that epiphany, and it's like, that kind of that real-time magic of creation, like what you're talking about, Steve. That's kind of what I felt like. And man, you mentioned that Madonna tour, and that's hilarious, because that show, and I remember it, and I think it was the Drowned World tour, and I think it was about 15 years ago, and that opening with the cathedral, I saw that too, and it absolutely moved me in that way as well. And of course, I came from theater originally, so I have notions about location, and about video's role in concerts and in other forms as a powerful tool to create that location. And I think a lot of content creators come to shows and they think from a cinematic vector. They're like, I'm going to make a music video to be behind this thing. And I tend to and that can be really fun and interesting. Like, you can go to psychological spaces that way. But I tend to think more like a scenic designer. I'm like, okay, what drop do I want to fly in for this? And
it's interesting that you talk about that too, that video's impact, like and where I think it crosses that line. I saw there was a production, and I'll murder his name, so I'm not even going to try, of West Side Story that was done just before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it's this Danish guy who reinvented
Yes.
And he utilized video. Basically, the entire back wall was a projection surface, and he had cameras on torms where you could see dance moves up close, and it was incredibly successful when he integrated the video into the organic performance space. They did a couple of pre-produced video pieces, and it fell flat. Then it became two-dimensional. At one point, he had Tony walking through a rainy street before he gets shot, and suddenly you're now no longer in the space, but you're watching a movie as a background to the space. And I think that horrible phrase of jumping the shark. Like, I think at that point, it felt lazy to me. It felt like, well, we've got this piece of content. We could probably do it with a camera on someone's boot, from that point of view, but that's a little too hard logistically or whatever. Let's just do that piece. And it was a decently produced piece, but it took something that I thought was incredibly moving and outer dimensional, and it made it that two-dimensional kind of thing. Bill Viola used to do these incredible video installations where, like, you didn't know what space you were in. And I mean, he was doing shit, in the 60s and really in the 70s when I saw him in San Francisco. And I've never seen anything like that since. And the closest I saw it was in the West Side Story thing, and then in Blake Shelton. I think that there's a couple of moments in the Blake Shelton show. One of my favorite moments that I think got cut where we're in this barn and we're discovering these paintings on the wall, and it's like, what, how did that happen? And I think because basically what Bob did is we were in this barn, and we had this conversation and said, wouldn't it be great if you went upstairs to one of the rooms in the barn and there was a bunch of old master paintings just laying on the ground like dusty. And he went and found a Jackson Pollock that was a love, one of the Jackson Pollock heart paintings, one early Pollock. And we found a couple of versions of that painting, as if the artist had done 3 or 4 versions of that painting. And they suddenly went from the ground and they were, up on the walls, and the camera went past them. So we discovered something, and we could use our little pet loves about contemporary art and impressionistic art in that environment. And that kind of stuff is, look, at the end of the day, we all want to make ourselves excited. We all want to get ourselves off. Like, we got to walk away going, isn't that cool? And how amazing is that? So that's our main motive. That, for me, that's my main motivation. If I don't walk away going, that's great, and how amazing is that, then I've kind of missed it. And in this show, there's one song I kept playing over and over again because it was the combination of all of that. It was the combination of music and lighting and content. And I don't even want to call it content. We have to come up with another word for this, because it's, it was, this environmental visual that went along with it. And it was a perfect match of all of that stuff. And what ends up happening with all good musical things like that is that the sum is greater than the parts. And you put these 3 things together, and suddenly you're in a 5th or 6th dimension of excitement because of that stuff.
It's interesting. It's interesting because for a while, virtual reality was sort of the buzzword, which never really took hold in the entertainment industry because it's a one-person thing with a headset. And then they tried like augmented reality, where you could hold your phone up at a concert, and because you downloaded an app, you could get an extra layer. But that was really sort of awkward because some people had it and some people didn't have it. And then there was a phone in everybody's face. So it seems like AI has sort of jumped into the fray and allows you to create these immersive kind of environments that you might have had to have a headset for in the past.
Very true. And with the quality of the product that's coming out, the high resolution video now that you can afford and take on the road, you're able to lose that layer of unbelievability, as in tear and interlacing and all that other kind of stuff happens in lower resolution. But here's the thing. This is the old man in me, the theory, which is the augmented reality, the virtual reality, the taking reality and trying to move it to some other space. When it comes to live theater, is a detriment, because you have one master to serve when you're doing this kind of stuff, and that is either the music, the script, the narrative, and that has to drive everything that you do. So if you are able to create an environment that is suggestive of the theme that you think the artist wants to put across, and in a lot of cases, the artist will tell you what they want to put across, and you can put that in a way where it is tactile, where you can touch it, but you don't have to do anything else but sit in your seat, then you've won. Then you've won. And you don't, and especially if you don't try and, I think that there's managing the limits of this stuff. I think you have to keep it within that bandwidth and not try and overreach, unless that's the brief. If you're doing Muse, you can overreach all you want,
Yeah, and by the way, that Muse show is pretty incredible. The one that's out right now, it's an amazing piece of work.
I haven't seen it.
Ellen, I'm afraid you've muted.
Is that the Sooner Routhier
yes,
tour?
It is a Sooner show.
Yeah. So, Steve, going back a little bit, you worked with Blake before. Tell us a little about your relationship with him as an artist.
Well, I got to work with Blake because I knew Narvel Blackstock and Reba McEntire for years, and eventually, finally, schedules worked out that I could actually do a Reba tour. And Blake and I hadn't worked together ever. They wanted me to do a Reba tour 30 years ago, and through personal stuff, I wasn't available. And finally, it got to the time where it was going to happen, and our friend Winky from Tay Towers, very good friends with Narvel, and Winky in the interim Winky and I had done a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen shows over the years, and so he and Narvel were very close, and he said, you know, you really should do this with Steve. And Narvel was like, yeah, I remember Steve. I think that'd be a really good idea. And Narvel is one of those few managers who understands production, who understands it very well, who speaks the language to us designers that we know how to execute what he wants, because he knows how it gets done. And we had a ball. That was the first show that Bob and I did where he created content for me on it.
That Reba production.
Reba show.
Yeah.
And we were sitting talking, and he had just finished doing a Blake show. Blake Shelton was just taking off. He'd just done a television show. And he said, and I was just bold, and I said, you should let me do Blake. And he said, I think that's a good idea. So he hired me. I did my first Blake Shelton tour.
In what year? Roughly?
13.
When was Reba?
I feel like Reba was 2012, 2013-ish.
So 2014, something like that.
It's like almost 10 years ago.
Almost 10 years ago. Yeah. And interestingly enough, my original design was 3 grain silos and trusses that look like a roof in a barn. So thematically, we've like kept this through line. Cool. Not completely intentionally. And we did that. It was very successful. He really loved it. We had a really good time. He was a nice guy. They went out and flogged that. 3-4 years later, I did another one, a very big industrial thing that was pretty cool. It was actually very cool. Painted all the trusses, made them all look like, you know, oil rig rust and all that kind of stuff. And they took that, flogged, and that went through a few iterations. You know, they took it out in full, then they cut it down, and they put the full show back together. So it was quite funny because I didn't expect to do this one. I sort of figured that they were going to move on. You know, my bandwidth with artists, with the exception of, you know, Billy and Henley, you know, I generally do 2 or 3 of them, and then they go find, you know, they go sleep with other women. But I didn't think that this was going to happen. We were out to dinner. I was down in Nashville, and we were out to dinner with Narvel, and he says, oh, by the way, we're going out in March, so start thinking about it. And I was like, oh, really? So that was, and in the interim, we've all grown, and we've all changed, and we've all done a bunch of other types of projects. I've been very much involved in television production. And so, you know, I haven't been doing a lot of live stuff, and Winky, who's moved on from Tay Towers, is sort of in the CEO advisory capacity, but the real people who have been relying on him for years as the executor of all these designs don't want to talk to anybody else. So Winky's like, hey, Steve, let's do Blake together, but let's just make sure it's fun. And I was like, as long as you can make sure it's fun, I'm in. And that was our through line all the way through, from the design process. And I'll tell you how this thing came about. It was pretty interesting. We were all, everyone was like, okay, we'll marshal the forces. You know, you have the entire Tate Towers drafting staff, and they'll execute anything you want. And you know, all you got to do is like napkin sketch. And I never napkin sketch anything. You know, I usually will open up 3D Studio Max and build a 3D environment. That's what I do. But at the time, my software licenses had all expired. I hadn't been drawing. I didn't have a computer that would boot up that had old software on it. So I got on the phone and I literally talked them through a napkin sketch. I don't think I even drew anything. I think I I showed him a picture of a flying V guitar, and I said, lay it down and put a video
that's funny.
lay it back, and that's your runway, and that's your bar, and that's the shape. And they all went, oh, well, that's what you're here for, Steve. So they went off.
The idea man.
I get, and listen, all design starts from architecture. Everyone, anyone who doesn't look, this is where we cut our teeth. I started designing things 40 years ago, and I designed things based on lighting trusses because that's the only scenery you ever had. So you had that was your language, and however you could cleverly configure that stuff. And then when you were able to do a custom stage shape, you had to make sure that it was built in a particular way that could be executed. You couldn't come up with these swoopy David Korn's Academy Award.
Right.
Sorry, you can't do that. So it's all about the architecture, and it's all about that being the jumping off place. And then to me, like songwriting, you write a melody, the melody tells you what that melody is going to want to say, then the lyrics come. It's the same thing with design for me. You come up with an initial architecture, the architecture then dictates the airspace above it. The airspace above it talks back to the architecture, and it's a communication between those two spaces. And the thing about Bob, why Bob made perfect sense is that we both design the exact same way. That's how we look at this stuff. We look at the piece of marble, and it's going to tell us where's the arm, where's the head, and it tells us, and then we react to it. So, but what made it fun was, then again, I had 10 draftsmen. It was really 3. And it was really 1, Guillermo Fuchs, who did all of that stuff, because we started.
Who is just such a superstar of that.
Superstar. And we did this great, once we started to get into it, because I know production. So I know, you cut 8 feet off of that, what the impact of 8 feet, means down the road. And a lot of these guys don't know that. So, they say, well, I could do this. Yeah, well, if you do that, you're going to have a pinch point over here. You're not going to have enough room for this over there. So we had 3 refinement conversations. I went up and had a meeting. They had a full set of drawings, and I went, well, this is good, but you can't present this. You can't present this to the artist, so you won't know what it is. They're used to seeing the colored renderings and the environment. So we've covered this in a couple of articles, but I got a dragooned Bob into doing it, said, hey, you got any bandwidth to do some renderings? Because I know you're good at Cinema 4D and you got your Unreal stuff. And he said, absolutely. And as I've said before, he just can't help himself. You put a project in front of him, and I get back renderings, but I get renderings with design decisions, with structural changes, and
oops.
And I go, well, I didn't think about that, but that's pretty cool. Okay, let's do that, but let's do it this way.
Yeah, you took the musical phrase and then you ornamented it, and then right. That jamming process, it began even then, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, and that's where your analogy is correct. That designing for music in a musical way is pretty natural. You'd think it would happen more often. So what ended up happening was a whole set of renderings came, and then they dictated some design changes. That all went to tape. That all got rejiggered. We figured out how to make all that stuff work. And really, I would have to say that 85% of the renderings are true to the real world. If you look at pictures of the show, which to me is a great indication of how this works. You look at those pictures and you look at the actual renderings, they're pretty freaking close. In a lot of cases they're not, but they're pretty close. And I shouldn't say in a lot of cases they're not. These days, it's much easier to execute from a 3D drawing. It's much easier to show a picture because you can now take that. In the old days, we would build models, but it's so we were kind of a little old school. We were it's almost exactly the same. but not, and in a way, it really opened up my eyes as to how the design could grow from the rendering point of view. And it didn't stop at the renderings. It grew from there.
Well, the fact that I did the renderings using Unreal, and that you refer to the architecture as being the core. It's like the starting point, right? You begin with this physical thing. We plotted and built that physical thing in Unreal too. And then when we got to tech and we were like, okay, now we've got this screen space which we can use to digitally extend, we were already in the barn. We were already in the place that we were extending and texturing and painting and lighting within. And that made it so easy. And it really was like the first time, like, again, you referred to the Madonna show, and I'd had an obsession with it forever. I can't tell you how many design situations I've approached and said, I'm going to make this feel, I want to fool the audience into not knowing, where does this begin and end? Like, what is real and what is set extension? What is the dream here and what is reality? And I don't think I ever got to it like we did on this show. And I think that's because we began with it and then we carried it all the way into production rehearsals, still using the tools, still and having that nimble nature that they gave us.
Well, and also we lived by a couple of rules, which was, you never want to see the edge of the screen.
Yes.
You never want to see the edge of the screen. And the minute we started to see the edge of the screen, we had to dial it back, because it's almost like, the magician showing the handkerchief, like when we showed the full screen, it was only during IMAG. So it looked like a completely different screen, and it was always in a different aspect ratio. But when we were in the environment, we never really saw where the edge happened. And that was a very simple rule, and a simple discipline. And that allowed us to create that edgeless, that where does one thing begin and where does another thing end? And the great unintended consequences of design is that you can think that all these things are going to work this way, but when they all fall into place and they make you make decisions based on what you see, then it becomes magic. That to me is the magic moment where, that runway looks like it's 300 feet long and it's only 80 feet long. Because we've fooled your eye, we've fooled the scale, we've played with your perception.
And can I be completely honest? The second day of rehearsal, so on the first day, Steve says, all right, let's look at the content. So we look at all the content, the stuff he talked about that we had pre-made and thought about, and the careful articulation, the old school process, the animating and the thing. And at the end of the day, we looked at all the content, and then we looked at the digital set extension stuff, the Unreal stuff. And it was just so powerful. And I remember that moment when Steve was like, we have to cut all the content, right? Like, we got to throw.
Oh, no.
And no. And there was, for that, in that moment, there wasn't even a second of that. I was like, oh, clearly.
Right.
Like, it was so powerful what was happening with the set extension. But nevertheless, what that did was I went to bed that night to a very sleepless night, because now any anchors I had going into tech, like any day, I thought, well, this day will go easier because I've got the song done and I can kind of like get ahead, maybe like Steve in one sentence threw that out the window for the rest of the tech process. So I had a sleepless night. I got up, I threw up. Because I'm a nervous wreck, right? I'm like, okay, we're gonna go improv, right? And and then we did. And to be clear, it wasn't improv, actually. Like, we were very thoughtful about it, but it was a process where we were committing to a high wire act of creativity in a way.
Well, but you gotta know, me, and I kind of scan the landscape, and I knew that I had the longest tech anyone could ever be indulged with. I had no interruptions. There was no band rehearsals. They were all there to serve us, basically. So I looked out at 2 weeks, and I went, in our normal pace, we could knock a show like this out in 3 or 4 days, because that's what we have to do most of the time. So I wasn't fearful when I said, we got to redo this. It was more like, don't you think we should? And that was my attitude, was like, don't you think we have the opportunity to make it better? It can be that if we want it to be that, but don't you think we should take that opportunity? And I also knew in the back of my head that there was an X factor here, because I know it's the wrong show, because we had a television star who is married to a visual artist, Gwen Stefani. That was an X factor. I didn't know if we were I knew that we would probably be held to a higher standard than normal, or a more exacting review process than normal, because of his relationship with Gwen. As it turned out, they're independent thinkers and it didn't matter. And I also think, as it turned out, the reason it turned out the way it did was because it was undeniable. See, this is the thing. If you can get a show that's undeniable, then you're done. Then you don't have anything to defend.
Yeah, it was inevitable.
And that was what it was. And it was just because of the process. So, do these come often? I don't think they come often. But I also think, from the designer, from my point of view, that when you do one of these, and I've had a couple of these over the past couple of years, you learn a little bit more how to set yourself up for success. And that's by the choices in the initial design brief, and also the choice of clients that you choose to work with. I have the luxury of being able to pick and choose who I work with, and I'm not at a place where I have to say yes to everything. So, I've been there. I've paid my dues doing that kind of stuff. So, a guy like Blake, or a guy like Lenny Kravitz, or a guy like John Mellencamp, or the Eagles, when they get me, they get someone who comes in knowing the landscape and knowing how to give them the best of what they think they want. I don't know if I could do this for Beyonce. I don't know if I could do this for Taylor. I don't know if I could do this for some of these artists that are out there today, because I believe that they are part of a world that has so many eyes and so many opinions, that level of trust, maybe, who knows, but I just think that understanding my limitations, or limitations is probably the wrong word, understanding my strengths and what I'm good at doing, and focusing on working with people who appreciate that is my goal now, and Bob and I get a chance to play, and we don't even know where this is going. This is not formal. It's like, but I'm certainly, if I get a call to do Beyonce, I'm calling Bob.
Right. Well, it's interesting because, like when Genesis went out with the first Vera light, that sort of became the seminal moving light concert. Is Blake going to be the poster boy forever for AI? It's like, this is like the threshold of a disruptive era in concert design. And you guys are on it.
Well, I want to clarify. This is not artificial intelligence. This is utilizing the tools that have created artificial intelligence.
Right.
But not allowing the artificial intelligence to make those choices.
Right.
And this is utilizing a gaming engine that was not invented. That's disruptive. We're using a gaming engine that wasn't invented to do what we're using it for. Although you look at the Star Treks and the Mandalorians, and you look at the Star Wars stuff, that is all Unreal. That's all from a gaming engine that has this ability to really change the landscape. There's an interesting project, everybody's talking about the Sphere in Las Vegas, and Mark Fafano, who's one of our collaborators on other stuff, went out there and did a fact-finding mission about possibly doing some work there. And he came back completely mesmerized at the possibilities of this high resolution surface that can literally replicate a live concert environment with lighting. I mean, with not only just with scenery, but with lighting, that if you get in there and you do it right, you won't know that there's not 300 instruments with 25 trusses up there. If you can go in, use Unreal and use it to its maximum effect, because there's so much power that comes out of these LEDs that if you can manipulate that, you could do a row of pin lights across and in smoke look just like moving lights, So, is it the way of the future? Absolutely. But it requires people who know how to do this with the old tools.
Right.
Can't walk in, because if you go in not knowing the old tools, you're basically going to make a video game.
Right.
So
it's interesting because that was a really good point about, like the programmer you said before about your other collaborator, Bob, on one side, and I assume it was a lighting programmer on the other side.
Felix Peralta, yeah.
Felix Peralta. And eventually maybe there's going to be some kind of AI coding for the console, and Steve is in, wherever you're living at the time, Miami, the Hamptons, Las Vegas, and you go, okay, let me see 400 Vari-lights moving at the top, at this intensity and this color, and there isn't a programmer. It understands what you're telling it and it does it.
Well, I've been talking a lot about AI as possibly empowering what I've been calling a new era of the auteur, which is to say, maybe more singular creative visions have a greater capacity to do more work. Like if you are a director or a multidisciplinary artist like Steve, who comes to that table with, the perspective of art history, musical and cultural contexts, a deep understanding of things like fashion, and all of the layer cake, like that adds up to Steve Cohen or Bob Bonial or, any number of other people that we know of, our colleagues. Those people who are armed with that context and cultural capacity, and they're going to be able to take these tools and go further with them than they have been able to go to before. Now, that said, is it inevitable probably that lighting control, it's like, are we going to see a Grand MA that has a promptable version of AI in it that allows for things to happen faster? Oh yeah, it, because that's how tech works. Tech will find the ways to introduce efficiencies and to innovations and evolutions. But does that put Felix Peralta out of a job? I don't think so, because Felix understands how to punch the buttons to get to a thing, but Felix also is taking a discussion that's happening between him and Steve with some seasoning that's getting lobbed over the fence from me and other ideas that are getting lobbed over the fence from other people sitting around us at the table. And then Felix has his own layer cake of context and background and influence, and he is synthesizing that, right? And so will Felix eventually have his own collaborator in the form of like machine learning or AI in the console that gives him powerful capacity to go further than he could have otherwise? Yeah. But
well, my contention is he already does. And I mean, when you talk about the dialogue that he has, he's got a dialogue with all of us, but he also has a dialogue with the machine.
Yeah.
And he spent a great deal of time. We picked some very untraditional tools that required a lot of number crunching to figure out how to make them not do the obvious things that the manufacturers laid out that they should do. And he spent a lot of time writing presets and manipulating the code to try and get them to react to do something organic. So, with AI, what will it, AI is only as good as the input, right? So if you have someone who has this layering understanding of the artistic process, and he speaks that into an artificial intelligence, the more detail he gives that artificial intelligence, the more the result is going to be what the vision of the artist has. Yeah, you'll be able to type I want to do, 400 Verilites doing a ballyhoo around the arena during a halftime show. Yeah, do that. And what will AI do? AI will search all of the examples of that in the world, and they will replicate what other people have done. That's the basis of it. But if you have someone like Felix who can walk in, who can go in and say, yes, I want you to take those 400 lights and ballyhoo the audience, but I want them to have an ascending color pattern, and I want the beams to, chase from one size to another. He will put his imperator on it, if that's the right word, and then it'll become another more complex layering of paint. Because that, you can't let it, you can't let it run by itself, because if it runs by itself, you might as well do test chases from a console onto a bunch of moving lights. You're muted again.
Sorry, I don't know why that keeps happening. So it sounds like it's like exciting new terrain for you guys, new tools, new challenges, new ways of working together. Sounds very exciting.
It definitely is. And I mean, Steve said at the end of me, he said, I'm never going back. Yeah. Like, we're never going to do a show the old way again. And I'm certainly in that camp, and and I'm like ready now in the next stage to take it to the next level. I mean, we were using Unreal to build stuff up and comp it up, and then moving it across to the servers. The next time Steve and I do this, we're just going to have Unreal in the server and be doing it more
right.
And take it to the next step of also linking all those lights that are in the Unreal scene via DMX to the console. So that, like what we did this time was more of a, I would follow, like Stephen and Felix were coming up with lighting looks, and I would say, they're going to go blue to aqua to back to blue here. And I would adjust the virtual scene to do the same things. And then we would take that piece of queued media and put it in the server. But, the next time we do this, Felix is going to be able to put that in the console.
Yeah. And the next time we do this, the video, where we'll spend money on video will, I will look at that video as an entirely new lighting rig. And not only will it have the virtual scenery in it, but it will have a complete lighting rig in it. And not only just one lighting rig, it'll have a lighting rig that transforms, because once again, you make it edgeless. You have a block of lights coming from a video screen that are pinpoint and can look like beams and smoke. All of a sudden, I've gone from, hey, that's a video screen, to, do they have lights behind the screen, or what am I looking at? It will be a layer of, like, the next time I envision putting one of these together, I'll be putting video panels as where I would be putting, pods of lights. And they'll be part of the virtual set, but they'll also be part of a lighting rig. I don't think I'll save anybody money, but that's kind of the next step. But you're going to get something from us that's different that you're going to get from Sooner. You're going to get something from us that's going to be different from a lot of the younger people out there, because I come from, where I come from. I'm the old man school, like I'm second generation. So, I think, I would love to have this conversation with Leroy. And I'd love to have this kind of conversation with Mark, because, with Brickman, because I think that those two guys, like me, come from that world and, that history. And I don't know if they've ever, sorry, I have a dog barking. I don't know if they've utilized it. They may have by now, but certainly this was a very big voyage of discovery for me, and I had a ball. We both had a ball doing it.
Yeah, we should talk to Alan Branton and Bob Barnhart and Bob Dickinson and some of the TV guys too, and see where that old school is coming up.
Oh, well, yeah. And the tool set is very much showing up in their world too. Like one of the big, there are a few different previs systems now, but one of the ones that's coming hot and fast is Carbon for Unreal, which allows you to build these complicated DMX rigs in Unreal and intuitively patch them into control. It's got a little, it's working to have sort of an equal place in the marketplace with other things like Depends or, just plain old MEON 3D stuff. But they're, the game engine showing up where they are too. The AI stuff is also showing up where they are too. Like these tools, like the AI is not going to be something that people think about as a thing. And it's just, I heard a really great, for several years now, I've been working on Amazon's conference about AI, robotics, and automation stuff. It's called Remars. And it started out as Jeff Bezos getting together with like a very small group of his favorite friends who were nerds, and they would kind of dream about the future. And then what innovation, what like moonshot innovation was going to be very disruptive. And that turned into this small conference that Amazon would do every year. And one year I heard she was basically the sort of not the chief information officer, but she was the senior most leader of Amazon who was in charge of AI. And she said, here's the thing, people think of AI and they think of big teams of developers and they think of coming up with software ideas. And what she said is AI is not that. AI is a utility. AI is something you're going to plug into in the wall, and it's going to empower whatever you're doing. Whatever process you can imagine, there are ways that AI can plug into it and sort the data faster, get you to conclusions quicker, make things clearer in a more rapid fashion, introduce efficiencies, introduce new capacities and capabilities. And it's funny, Steve alluded to the idea that, normally we would get through the show in 3 or 4 days, and now we had 14. The funny thing is, the AI didn't like, one of the biggest things it empowered us to do was to have more time. And we still got through the show in 4 days. Right. And then we got to go back and do it again. Right. And go back and do it again. Like, it wasn't so much that we languidly spent whole days on one tune. We cranked through the show. By the 4th day we were there, we were done with the show. And then we get to go back and smooth it and detail it and look at numbers and say, let's throw that out and let's do something else. Because, now that we see what's adjacent and now that we see where we're coming and going from, like the AI part of it, I think the biggest benefit it gave us was this ability to have an idea and move really quickly. And then we would never take what the AI spit out and just take that. We were generally taking that and then moving that into Unreal. So that became the paintings up in the attic. That became, our various art direction stuff that was in the gaming engine. It was definitely a combination of, of those technologies that led to that result. Mm-hmm. What I love, Steve, about you is like like you can find these little seeds of that all the way back in your origin story, where you're like, like you showed up for Billy and you had gotten the idea to like be more theatrical in your positions, and how could you do that? And that at that point the technological leap was like something that was the progenitor to swing wing truss, kind of, sort of, not swing wing truss, but like pre-rigged positions, which then allowed you to do this more theatrical thing, and I love the way that you revealed the success of that, which is you got that phone call from Billy and he said, we don't know what happened. Like, when we go from this song to this song, there was an audience reaction we'd never seen before, and we all got together and we're like, we didn't change the music, and we didn't change the sound, and we didn't change, anything else. So it had to have been what Steve did, and that was because it wasn't because the technology itself was cool. It was because what that suddenly afforded Steve to do was to have a flexibility to make that show more theatrical.
Yeah. Right. And you elicit an emotional response from the audience.
Well, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. That's what we do. I've always said that it's, rock and roll lighting, musical lighting is 2 things. It's composition and timing. And if you, which to me is the same thing that great music is, it's composition and timing. And it's if you lose that as a baseline for the way you approach this, I believe that you're selling the art form short. And I think that there is a particular there's a particular expediency to doing lighting and video and tech for music, because there are so many people in the industry that look at indulging us artists with the time that you would say to have a Broadway show in tech or shooting a segment of television. No, we don't have that kind of time. We have X amount of dollars. There's a lot of people. We got to put this thing, so like knock it in. And I think that one of the other advantages, that one of the things we learned with Blake was, yeah, we know how to do this in 4 or 5 days, but we're not going to give back that time. We're going to take this as an opportunity to go back and fine tooth comb this stuff. And the result is, the proof is in the pudding. They walked away thinking, that Blake walked away thinking this is the best show he's ever done, let alone the best show he's ever seen. So I can't.
Well, kudos to both of you. It looks absolutely stunning. The photographs are just out of the ballpark.
And we've had the opportunity to play more. Steve, I didn't mention it to you yet, but there's been a little bit of an online hubbub in the world of the fandom for Billy, because one of the Billy fans apparently used Midjourney, one of the AIs that I use, and made a new version of "We Didn't Start the Fire."
Which Billy saw and sent to me. No, there's 3 of them out there.
Oh, there's
now.
3 of them now, of course, yeah.
And the funny thing is the ones that the guys didn't spend any attention. If you watch them, they phonetically spell a topic and put it on a billboard because they don't have the attending historical thing, because they basically just let AI do it. And it's really fun because the one you're talking about is very, very good. I actually reached out to them because I wanted to license it, because I wanted to, it's like a thing for me. Like now, if there's a few of these, it'd be something that I'd want to put into the show. Like, and tonight we're featuring this,
that's cool.
but the interesting thing is, you look at the one that's good, and then you look at the other 2, and the other 2 are just straight AI. Hey, let's, give me visual images for "We Didn't Start the Fire," and they can't understand the lyrics, so they come up with something that isn't right. And the people that they don't know, or that maybe are too obscure, they're pictures of people that sound like them. It's pretty interesting.
Well, and a little peek behind the curtain, when we did that song for the new stadium design, and Carl Glob designed that, the fabulous Carl Glob, we did a lot of the images, and we thought, oh, this is wonderful. This is an amazing, perfect use for AI, because that song references so many people and so many historical situations. And for many of them, there are only so much material that exists that photographically depicts these things. And some of that can be hard to get, or if not impossible, or hard to find, or hard to license, or any and all of that. So we're like, okay, perfect thing to use AI. And Carl and I worked for a while to build a bunch of stuff. And I remember the first time we sat down with Steve, we're like, okay. He's like, well, that's Joe DiMaggio that's
like Joe DiMaggio.
Look enough like Joe DiMaggio. And like, you were pretty relentless at weeding out, and we ended up weeding out like a lot of, we replaced everything in those AI slots.
Most of it.
A few times.
Okay, so you're going to like this one. This is a scoop to both of you. So the postscript on all of that is, usually we indemnify the artists. Billy will indemnify anybody for any kind of claims. So, we're positioned to do all of that. And we never executed it, but it was kind of understood. So we play LA. We play SoFi. And 3 days later, Lee Eastman, Billy's attorney, gets a notice from Sony Pictures and says, we noticed that there's a poster of Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai, and some other film. And we've gone through our files and seen that there's no licensing agreement to utilize that. So Lee sends me an email and he goes, what's this about? So I, of course, say, hey, I've been using these images for a long time. This is just a redo of that. And to tell you how great our organization is, he says, okay, well, let me see how much they want. So he called them up. I think he cut a deal with Sony Pictures for $1,500 and he paid it. And it's like, now they're licensed. But, you laugh about this, thinking that you can get away with this kind of stuff. And where did they notice it? In Hollywood.
Of course.
And ironically, who's the studio? Sony. Who's signed to? Sony. Like of all things, it was Lee's like, are you really seriously going to ask Billy to pay you $1,500 to use a poster for Bridge on the River fucking Kwai?
That is a scoop. I hadn't heard that yet.
That is funny.
I meant to tell you that. So
that's funny.
All right.
Well, thank you for spending the time with us today. I mean, we could talk for hours, and we have, and we will again. But
I'm really happy. I hope that this thing takes off, and I think knowing you guys, you're going to get really smart and fun people to talk about, and I'll jump on,
including you.
I'll jump on anytime. It'll be
great. Great.
We're going to hold you to that commitment. You may live to regret that.
No, I won't.
Well, and if it ever becomes a live event, we'll certainly bring you out there.
When it becomes a live event, not yet.
It'll be fun.
Very fun.